Hello, everybody. I'm Becky, one of the pastors here. It is great to be with you this morning, but I have a little confession to make. I'm just feeling kind of old today. Old. I know, right? Some of you are like, girl, you ain't seen nothing yet. But I am. Okay, this is why. I was looking through pictures last night, trying to come up with a family Christmas card. And just looking at the difference in pictures from January to this fall, my son, Beckett, my middle son, he went from being eye level with me to being several inches taller than me in the course of 7 months. Like, it feels like yesterday I had these babies just crawling all over me, and now my children sound like men, and I have to look up at them in order to make eye contact. Like, what is even going on? And it's not just my kids. My nephew, Zachariah, my oldest nephew, he turned 20 years old in October. What? 20? 20? And I never forget how old Zachariah is, because when he was 3 months old, he was actually the ring bearer at Willie and I's wedding. Oh my goodness, so cute, right? I still have that outfit that Zach wore at our wedding with the little rings on top. The rings are on our fingers now. To be totally honest, I just wasn't super into babies when I was younger. They were cute and everything, but I didn't really get the big deal. But then, oh my goodness, Zachariah was born. Zachariah. I was so into this kid. It was a little, I don't know, over the top. I could not get enough of Zachariah. And sometimes Willie and I, we would babysit Zach in our little newlywed apartment up in Ipswich, Massachusetts. And one of Zach's favorite games to play when we would babysit him was hide and seek. Have you ever played hide and seek with a 1-year-old? Hide and seek. Right? This is how it would go. Zachariah would hide by putting his hands over his face and kind of looking out, peering out through his fingers, and we'd be obliged to say, "Where's Zachariah? Has anybody seen Zachariah? Oh no, where did he go?" And we'd look under pillows, we'd look behind doors, we'd be like, "I don't know, Zachariah isn't anywhere to be found." And then all of a sudden, Zachariah would open his arms wide with the goofiest of grins and wait for us to say, "There he is, there's Zachariah." And Zach would just explode into this deep, hysterical laughter from his belly. And what made the game so fun was the fact that Zach thought we couldn't see him, or at least that we were willing to pretend. But in actuality, being that he was one, I don't remember exactly how old he was, Zachariah probably would have actually been terrified if he thought that he really was all alone, if he couldn't see us, and if he thought that nobody could see him. Right, that's how attachment works in those early years of child development. The child can see that they are loved and cared for. They can venture out. They can grow and explore and experience the world because they know that they are actually not alone, that they are seen. And yet, how many times in life do we feel the opposite? Do we feel like nobody can see us, like we are alone? Now, I'm guessing that most of us could think of a time like that in our lives when we felt alone, when we felt like nobody could see us. I was actually just talking with my sister, Zach's mom, about it this past week. How, especially as a single parent, she can feel like no one sees her. Like she is just grinding away at life, dealing with the various inevitable crises of life with 3 kids, making ends meet, trying to keep the house together, not to mention do something for her own self and her own soul. It can all feel so exhausting and thankless when there's nobody there to witness your late nights, your early mornings. It can feel like she's unseen, like she's just alone. When have you felt alone like that? Like no one can see you. In those moments Of loneliness, it's even worse when we feel like not even God sees us. In fact, that might be the worst kind of loneliness there is, when it feels like God has abandoned us to our circumstances, just left us to fend for ourselves. I've shared this before, but I remember feeling like that when I was far from family, studying for England for a year in college, and I got really sick. I think I was feverish in bed for almost a week by myself before I talked to a single human. I felt so alone. I felt so scared. I remember actually thinking to myself, I could die right here and nobody would even know. Thankfully, my parents had no idea how sick I was at the time, or they would have been sick with worry. They would have been on the first plane headed to the UK. But nonetheless, especially as I sunk into depression during and following that illness, my experience was of a sense of darkness, like not even God was anywhere to be seen, anywhere to be found. And now there are many in Scripture who knew the kind of darkness that I experienced during that time, actually darkness much more thick, much more intense and terrifying. Today marks the first day of Advent. It's actually the season in the Christian calendar when we remember this darkness. It's a time when we just kind of sit in it a little bit. When we remember not only our own darkness, but also the darkness the Israelites felt all those years ago when they waited for the long-promised Messiah, the one who would finally rescue them from the darkness of exile and oppression. Advent is the season when we remember that darkness and when we wait and watch for the promised one. Jesus, who would pierce that darkness with his light, God in flesh appearing to humankind. That's how the classic carol talks about Christ coming. Word of the Father now in flesh appearing. It's nothing less than the personal appearance of God in human flesh to us. Now, I know that Easter is supposed to be the apex of the Christian year, the most important day for Christians. And while I love Easter, there is just something about Advent. Something about God coming to us, to you, to me. God coming to us in this way. It just gets me. It gets me because while Christ's death and resurrection do save us and set us free, that salvation, it begins with Christ coming to us in the first place. So if Easter means that ultimately we are rescued from struggle in this life, well then Christmas means that in our struggle, we are never alone. It means that we have a God who is with us, a God who sees us, and a God who promises to appear to us. Do you believe that? As we wait for Christ's coming this Advent, that's what we're going to be looking at together. Not just Christ coming at Christmas, but coming in other ways and in other places in the Scriptures, places where God appeared. We're going to notice how God has already come to us and how that helps us know what we are looking for. It helps us know where to look. It's a way of attuning our ears and our eyes and our hearts so that when Christ appears, we can recognize him. We can recognize him in our world and in our lives. And now, one of my favorite God appearances, it's the story of Hagar that Wasim just read for us. I mean, talk about darkness. Hagar was a slave. Hagar was a slave. She was an Egyptian, far from home, living among the Israelites, and not only was Hagar a slave, the property of Sarai, her mistress, but when Sarai can't get pregnant, she deals with the shame of that by giving Hagar to her husband. She hopes that Hagar will bear a child that Sarai can then claim as her own. Now, in the version we just heard, it was a little bit more honest. It said that Sarai gave Hagar to Abram to sleep with him. Other versions, a number of versions, they just say Sarai gave Hagar to her husband. So if you're just kind of reading along mindlessly, that can sound simple, even innocuous. Oh, Sarai gave Hagar to her husband. But Sarai gave Hagar to her husband. What? Hagar becomes a different kind of slave. She is asked to conceive and carry a child that would not even belong to her. Now, in all fairness, as modern readers, we're horrified at this. In the ancient world, it was more common. For those of you who've read much of the Bible, you might remember how Leah and Rachel, they were in this competition for how many babies they could bear to their husband Jacob. So what they do is give Jacob some of their servants to bear him additional children so that they can add tallies to their side of the score sheet. Now, maybe it was commonplace, but I can't imagine that made it any less traumatic an experience to be given to a man like that. And now, for however righteous or not Sarai's intentions may have been, that's a sermon for another day. Regardless, the result is that Hagar was treated like a pawn. Treated as nothing more than a childbearing vessel, a mere means to an end in her mistress's determination to procure progeny. And that's just the beginning. Right? When Hagar does conceive and is upset by it, Sarai takes offense. And with Abram's blessing, with the blessing of the man who had gotten her pregnant, Sarai mistreated Hagar. Now, we got to unpack that word mistreated a little bit. It is the same language used to describe how the Israelites were treated by the Egyptians when the Israelites were slaves in that nation. Same language. Like, we are not off to picture something like back-breaking labor, maybe even, probably even physical violence. In other words, Sarai abused Hagar. That's what the angel's word for Hagar's misery connotes. It's harsh handling, humiliation, abuse. So not only was Hagar forced to marry and conceive a child by her mistress's husband, when Hagar tries to express any sense of agency or voice in the matter, when she protests, her mistress doubles down in mistreatment, making Hagar's life not only lonely and sad, but downright terrifying. It's no wonder that she runs, but when she runs, what hope does Hagar have? She is an escaped Egyptian slave, penniless, alone, a woman, pregnant in the middle of the desert, far from home. She might have a family somewhere who loves her, who would care, but they aren't here. In almost every sense of the word, Hagar is alone. Nobody sees her. Nobody sees the misery that she suffers. Nobody except somebody. Now, the text says that the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. In the middle of seeming nowhere, the angel of the Lord found Hagar. Now, it's important to note that this Hagar, she is the very first person, not only in the book of Genesis, but in the whole of the Bible, to be encountered by an angel of God. Now, the word of the Lord had come to Abram in a vision, but this is something different. It's not even just an angel of the Lord who comes to Hagar, because as we read on, the text names Hagar's visitor as the Lord. The Lord. So as amazing as visions and angels are, Hagar is visited personally by none other than the very real presence and power of God. And not only does God visit her, but unlike Abram and Sarai, God calls Hagar by name. Hagar. And it's not even over Zoom, it's in person. Who does God appear to and where? God appears to Hagar, the disenfranchised Egyptian slave in the middle of the desert. And this is the wild part, actually two wild realities here. All right, so one, Hagar, the outsider, she recognizes God. She recognizes the voice of the Lord. She knows God's presence when she sees and experiences it. For all the misery in her life, it's almost as though she was attuned, ready, waiting, maybe even hoping, watching. The other wild reality here, right? Hagar does something audacious. Hagar becomes the only person in the whole of the Hebrew scriptures to do this. Hagar names God. She names God. Now, if you know that story, Moses asks God what God's name is. But apparently Hagar doesn't even have to ask. She knows God's name based on her own real, living, life-changing experience of God's own presence. Hagar declares, "You are El Roi, the God who sees me." All this time, Hagar has been on her own. She has been mistreated. She has been used. She has been abused. When the angel of the Lord first appears to her and asks, "Where are you coming from, and where are you going?" Hagar replies only, "Oh, I'm running away." She doesn't answer both questions. There's this sense in which for however much she had been hoping that God would show up, that hope is waning thin. Hagar can only say where she's coming from, but that's it. She's tired. She's beaten down. She doesn't see a way forward. There's a past, but she's not so sure about that future. And right there, where it feels like she has no hope, where it feels like she has no future, right there is where God shows up, and suddenly there is hope. Because God sees her, Hagar has a future. And it is startling, mind-blowing, really, the promises that God makes to her here. And actually, another first here, Hagar is the first person to be encountered by the angel of God, and she is the first woman in Scripture to receive promises. And what's even more interesting is that the promises sound an awful lot like the promises that God had made to Abram back in Genesis 15. The angel says, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." Now, Hagar was mistreated. She was used and abused for the sake of providing somebody else's progeny. What God gives her in the end is her own progeny. God gives her her own hope, her own future. And this isn't the same covenant that God makes with Abram and Sarai, but out of the wreckage of the injustice done to her, God sees Hagar, and God does something new and beautiful in and through her life. Now, the details of how this all happens, it can be kind of confusing, even alarming. I mean, the angel of the Lord tells Hagar to go back to her abusive mistress and submit to her. What? Submit to abuse? This is the kind of thing that makes people want to throw their Bible out the window. With good reason, at least on face value. Like, you don't tell a vulnerable person to return to an abusive situation. You do not do that. God does tell Hagar to return. But what's interesting is that when she does, at least at first, there's no mention of Sarai. The text simply says, Hagar bore Abram a son. And Abram gave him the name Ishmael, the name that the angel of the Lord had told Hagar. So with that affirmation of Hagar, the acknowledgement of how God had come to her and spoken to her, suddenly Hagar moves safely and profoundly to the foreground of the story, and Sarai moves to the background. In other words, it seems that maybe Abram learns about how the angel visited Hagar, and this is filling in more details than the text gives us here, but at least on my read, there's a sense that maybe Abram tells Sarai to back off. Maybe that he recognizes God's presence and movement, that maybe he even steps up to protect Hagar like he should have done in the first place. There's a sense in which maybe God paved a safe return to Hagar as the particular means by which God would fulfill God's promises to Hagar and to her son. Whatever the details of that return, and that is something for us to wrestle with, whatever the details, this is what happens. Hagar is able to safely deliver Ishmael, and by now it seems clear that this is Hagar's son. It's Hagar's son. It's not Sarai's son. And for those of you who know it, there is more to Hagar's story. Eventually, Sarai turns on Hagar and Ishmael and compels Abram to kick them out of the household so that Ishmael won't have any share in the inheritance. You can read about that in Genesis 21, and when you do, you'll find what you might expect by this time. God appears to Hagar again. God provides for her so that she and her son are spared, so that they have a way forward, now finally and totally out from under the oppressive hand of Abram and Sarai. And this is where we can make more sense of what the angel said about Ishmael back in Genesis 16. We skipped over this verse earlier. But Hagar was told by the angel that her son would be a wild donkey of a man, and he would live in hostility toward all his brothers. Not exactly a mother's dream for her child, to be a wild donkey of a man living in hostility. But the point of that is what's important. And the point is that Ishmael's existence would be a free one, that he would be free. Right, living in hostility with each other, it was commonplace for nomadic peoples in the ancient world. And what it indicates is that Ishmael's going to hold his own. He's going to make his own way. He's not going to live his life under the same kind of captivity and oppression that Hagar experienced. And for an enslaved mother, what more could you want? That your son wasn't going to experience the same horrors that you did in your life, that your son was going to be free. Now, God sees Hagar in her distress, right? God is this ever-present parent who even when we play hide and seek, when we put our fingers over our faces or even hide under the blankets, this is the God who looks upon us all the while, never allowing us to wander from that loving and certain and protective gaze. God sees Hagar and her distress, and God appears to Hagar in a way that she can recognize, in a way that she can see, even as God sees her. She says, I have now seen the one who sees me. So in so appearing, God not only gives present comfort to Hagar, allowing her to just taste God's goodness and kindness when she was all alone there in the desert, but God gives Hagar a hope and a future. Because ultimately, as she listens, as she trusts, and as she walks in the way that God calls, God sets Hagar free. Now, you heard earlier about the ministry of Hagar's sisters, a ministry that provides support, care, and empowerment for women who, like Hagar, are coming out of domestic violence. Sometimes this violence is physical, sometimes it's emotional or spiritual. There are all kinds of ways for a partner to handle harshly, to humiliate, to abuse, and control. But whatever the specific situation, as Hagar's sisters explains on their website, too often those who experience domestic violence feel like no one sees them. Or worse, they wish no one did. It's easy to feel unlovable and inconsequential when the one closest to you routinely mistreats you. It's easy to feel unlovable and inconsequential when the one who is supposed to be on your side and in your corner, when the one who is supposed to protect you hurts you. It's easy to feel that way when you're just alone, when for whatever reason you just feel like nobody sees you. And this is what I so love about the ministry of Hagar's sisters, that not only that these women who've experienced abuse by a loved one call one another sisters, but that they seek to stand firmly in the gap, to be the angel of the Lord showing up in the desert for one another when they need it most, offering comfort and kindness like we heard about in Callie's story. And also also that they seek to help recover every woman's sense of her own worthiness, her knowing deep within that she is deserving of love, deserving of safety, that in the hope and promises of the God who sees us, she has power, she has a future. And friends, that is what I want you to hear this morning. That is what I want you to know. That when God appears to us, what God did for us in Jesus. In Jesus, God appeared to us, walked with us in his death and resurrection. Jesus faced the bleakest of human prospects, the most lonely of circumstances. Not only was he unseen, he was abused, he was mistreated, he was misunderstood. Jesus walked in our loneliness and pain so that ultimately we could be set free from it, and so that we would never, ever be alone in it, so that we could have a new future, just like Hagar had a new future. So is there something in your life right now that just feels like a dead end? A place in your life where you feel stuck, where you feel alone, where you feel unseen? Well, what Hagar's story teaches us, what the story of Jesus means for us, is that in truth, we are never alone. Rather, we have a God who appeared to us in Jesus and who never left. A God who looks on you, who gazes on you with tenderness and love. It's only that, unlike Hagar, sometimes we just don't have the eyes to see the God who already sees us. So our invitation today, the invitation of the story of Hagar, it's twofold. One, it's to learn to recognize God's presence like Hagar was able to recognize God's presence. And two, it's to respond, to listen, to trust, and to move with that presence as Hagar did. So taking that second invitation first, one of the things I love about the second part of Abram and Sarai, of Hagar's story, is when Abram and Sarai kick her out of the house in Genesis chapter 21. Like at first she's desolate, no water, no protection, so she just lays her son down to die and weeps. But the minute God speaks, she recognizes God's voice again and she listens. God tells her, "Don't be afraid. Come lift up the boy, hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." The text says that then God opened Hagar's eyes to see a well of water, and what did Hagar do? She got up, she lifted up her boy, she took him firmly by the hand, she filled her skin with water, and she gave her boy a drink. You see, it's not enough to just recognize God's presence, as important as that is. You also have to act on it. You got to get up and move when God calls. And sometimes that can look as ridiculous as trusting that there might be some way forward for you, even when you're a slave in the middle of the desert with nothing but an empty water skin and an unrealistic pipe dream, that someday maybe you and your son might be free. Now, whatever it is for you, it's not enough to just recognize God's presence. You've got to act on it. But sometimes it's that we can't even see God's face in the first place. We can't see God who sees us. And to be honest, that's me a lot of the time. I have a lot to learn from Hagar because I can be so thick. I can be so distracted, so bullheadedly self-reliant that I can just fail to see God present and at work in my life and in the world around me, even when it's right in front of my face. So if you're like me, what we need to do is to learn how to see in the first place, to learn how to listen for God. And one way we can do that is through spiritual exercises aimed at helping us slow down, get quiet, and just notice. And for any of you women in the room who might be interested, there's a group of us who are gathering from our women's community this Tuesday night at 7 p.m. right down the hallway in the family room. We're going to talk a bit about prayer, hopefully demystifying it some. And we're also going to try out my latest favorite way of praying called centering prayer. And centering prayer, it's what it is. Like, we take a break from thinking so much to just be with ourselves, to be with God, so we can learn to savor God's presence, to recognize God's presence. But another way that we can pay attention, that we can learn to see and listen, it's through remembering times in the past when God has shown up in our lives, times when I was in the desert and all of a sudden God was there too. And sometimes we don't always see it in the moment, but in hindsight, we're like, oh my goodness, God was there the whole time. And we can take such comfort, such consolation in remembering the ways in which God has shown up for us in the past. But what's even better is that remembering those experiences helps us recognize God more easily and readily the next time. And that's true for me when I remember that time when I was sick, far from home. God showed up for me in that time in a million ways, and the result is that I'm less scared of being alone. I'm less scared of getting sick. I'm less scared of anxiety and depression than I was before I experienced God showing up for me in those circumstances. So can you think of a time like that right now? A time when you felt unseen, when you felt alone, and God showed up. Hagar gave God a name when God appeared to her. What name might you give God from that moment or season in your life? For me, it might be God who loves me at my worst. Maybe God whose mercies are new every morning. But what's your name for God? We're going to turn now to a time of prayer and song. And as we do, this might sound a little audacious, but that's the example Hagar set. I'm going to invite you to invite God to appear to you. Maybe it will be through a recollection of past experiences, maybe through your own naming of God, or just right here, right now, to say, God, give me eyes to see you gazing upon me. Give me eyes to see and give me courage to return that gaze, to get up and move in the way that you lead. Let's pray. God, this world is big. And sometimes, though we could be sitting in a room filled with people, maybe even living in a house full of people, we could feel so alone. Like nobody sees us, like nobody understands. God, this is the miracle of you. This is the miracle, the gift of Jesus. God who came to us in human flesh and never left. You, our Lord, who looks upon us with loving kindness, with tender mercy, seeing and knowing it all. You love us there as you see us. And as you see us, as you speak our name, you give us something new. You work something fresh and miraculous in our lives. You give us a hope and a future. Oh God, help us to see you here today, to know you. Appear to us, God. Appear to us by the power of your Spirit. Let us see your face. Let us hear your voice. Amen.